All right, hello. So in this video, we're going to be introducing CSS, which is sort of the other programming language that we're going to use when doing web pages. We're going to spend a lot of time in this course talking about CSS. So this is going to be only the barest basics just to sort of introduce the concept, just so you know what we're talking about when we say these letters CSS in the future. And so you can begin to understand sort of why some things are not done in HTML and are instead done inside of CSS. So again, we're going to talk about a lot more detail. We're going to do a lot more on this in the future, but this again just designed to whet your appetite for CSS, as it were. So we're going to talk about in this video, so we'll talk about how to include CSS code into our web files, into our HTML files. We'll introduce the vocabulary we're going to use with CSS, which are the ideas of rules, selectors, and properties. And then we'll briefly talk about sort of why we have these two different languages, why we need to learn two different things on the first day of class in this course. Okay, so the basic idea behind CSS, right, why we're doing things, is that we already have a web page, right? This is our web page more or less that we were built off in the previous demo, and it kind of looks like crap, right? Like, I mean, it's content, it's text, but it doesn't look very nice, right? So the idea is, the question is, how do we make it look good, right? We don't want to look like a really, really bad website that's written only in HTML, right? A website from the 80s or the 90s, I guess, right? We want to make it look like a modern, beautiful looking web page. So the way that we're going to do that, the way we're going to achieve this kind of beautiful aesthetic designs in code, right, the development perspective, is by using what's called CSS. So CSS is another acronym, just like HTML is an acronym. CSS is an acronym that stands for Cascading Style Sheets, also just referred to as style sheets or CSS. What CSS is going to be is it's going to be another language, right? It's another set of syntax, another way of describing the rules for styling a web page, right? They're going to indicate what a page looks like. Effectively, we're going to write rules like use this color and font for the first paragraph, use this picture for the background, use this color for the background, use this size for the images. Right? It's going to basically let us specify all these styling rules and then which elements we want those styling rules to apply to. It ends up working a little bit like sort of styles or themes in PowerPoint, but it's way more powerful. We can customize it in much more complicated ways. And we're going to spend most of the course learning about more and more ways to customize and manage our CSS as we go. Without going too far, because again, this is a beginning class. Okay, so the CSS code, right, that we're going to write is going to go into its own file. It doesn't have to. It's technically possible to write it directly into the HTML. You should never do that. It's considered really bad practice. It's really bad style. I will be very disappointed if you do that. Do not do that. We always put our CSS into its own file. That file can then be referred to as often called the style sheet, right, or the CSS file. So we're going to put it in there. I've gone ahead and in our example code here, right, so you can see I've got our sidebar open. So I've got my index.html file. I also then have a style.css file that is currently inside of a CSS folder. If I double click on it, it's empty. There's nothing in this file yet, but that's the file we're going to be working with. If you look at this in Finder, again, I've got my style.css that's inside of my CSS folder. So all of our CSS code is going to go into that style sheet file, into that separate file, which you can call anything you want as long as it ends in .css. And again, the file extensions are there primarily for the operating system. We will often call them style.css just by convention. So great. Here's an example of some CSS code. We'll go over what this looks like in a second, but I just want to be able to put this, I want to be able to paste this code in so you can see what it looks like. What we're doing here is we're basically saying we want to make our headings have Helvetica as a font. We'll talk about sort of what that looks like. Once we've done that, like just writing a CSS file, just making it exist and writing some code inside of it, doesn't change the appearance of my web page, right? My web page looks exactly the same. So what we're going to need to do is we need to tell this HTML file that it needs to use that style sheet, right? That's the set of styling that it wants to include, that it wants to be part of and apply to this page. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to modify our HTML file, and we're going to add another element called a link element inside of the head. So again, the head was our metadata, it's information about the page. And what we're going to do is we're going to add in a link element. So we're going to say that there's some metadata, some information about this page is that it is linked to, it is connected to a CSS file. All right, my link element is going to take two attributes. One of them is going to be a rel attribute, which stands for the relationship. So in this case, we're going to say our relationship is that this is a style sheet. And that's, again, my way of saying that there's a connection, right? There's a link between these two pages, these two files, the HTML file and the CSS. And the relationship is that the CSS, one of them is a style sheet. You can think of the relationship, it's a little bit like putting your relationship on like social media, right? You know, married, single, just looking. Our relationship here is style sheet. The second attribute we're going to put is going to be an href. And again, href is going to indicate where do I want to find this, where can I find this style sheet else file? Similar to what my href was saying, where do I want my link to go to? My link, where do I want my hyperlink to go to? My href here is going to indicate where do I find the style sheet. We'll talk about this, the sort of how we write these things out in more detail in a future video, but because this is inside the CSS folder and it's called style.css, I'm going to write down css/style.css to indicate go to the CSS folder and then find the style.css file. We'll talk about the syntax a little bit more in detail in a more video, but I want to just like get it started for us at the moment. Once we've done that, once we've linked that in, then when I refresh my page, you'll notice that my title is now Helvetica. It's now no longer in a serif font. It now looks sort of distinct. Okay. And so again, we add a link element in the head. Usually we put it at the bottom of the head, and that's how we sort of connect in a style sheet. I want to take a moment to note that this is a link element. This thing here is an anchor element, but an anchor element is providing a hyperlink. And when I talk about this thing, I'm calling this a link to the iSchool homepage. In programming, there's a lot of jargon. I mentioned that before. And a lot of that jargon is reused to mean different things in different contexts. So when I talk about a link, that can mean one of two things. I can either mean a link like a hyperlink, right? Something you click on to go to another web page, right? A navigation element. Or I can mean a link like a style sheet connection. And those are two different kinds of links. So we want to be really, it's hard sometimes, but we're going to try to be clear about what kinds of thing we're talking about. When I talk about a link element, that's this thing. That's for including CSS. When I'm talking about adding a link to a page, that's probably about adding a hyperlink that you can go somewhere else, right? We'll use those words interchangeably because they get used depending on the context. That said, adding a link to a page involves using an anchor element. Connecting a style sheet to a page involves using a link element. And yes, they are the same terms, and yes, they are confusing. That's a little bit what's involved in programming. It's a little bit part of what makes programming really challenging is that we use words that have very specific meanings and technical meanings in certain contexts, but then they have different meanings in different contexts, and then different meanings in the ways that people actually use these words from day to day. All right, so that links in our CSS file. Okay, so let's talk about what this looks like. A CSS file includes inside of it a bunch of different rules for how to style the page. So when we're writing CSS, what we're going to be writing is we're going to be writing a bunch of rules. You could think of a rule as an instruction to the browser to say, here is how you should style the page. I often think of CSS as a little bit like giving your instructions to like, if you're going to have someone to come in and paint your house or someone to come in and like decorate a room for you, the CSS is the instructions about what they're supposed to do. Paint that wall red. Paint the trims yellow. Don't paint the ceiling, right? We're like, well, you can't say don'ts, but like given that kind of set of instructions about what things should be painted or colored and styled in what way, you know, hang this picture on that wall, put this couch in that corner, right? Giving that instructions is what a CSS file is going to do. So we're going to write CSS rules, properties. Our CSS files is a set collection of these rules. A rule has two parts. The first part is the first thing we write is what's called the selector. And we're going to write that at the start of our rule, right? That's the beginning of my rule. So in this case, I've got an H1. And that's the selector here. The curly braces come after the selector. The H1, the selector tells us what elements is this rule going to apply to? What elements are we going to style? And there's lots of different ways we can select things. We'll talk about this more detail for the next couple of weeks. But for now, we're going to talk about selecting elements by using what are called element selectors or tag selectors. Or basically just write down the name of the tag that we want the rule to apply to. So for example, I have this rule that applies to all H1 elements. I could add another rule, right, that applies to all paragraph elements. So this is all H1s. That's all paragraphs. I can have another rule that applies to all images. And what I'm going to do is I'm just writing down the name of the tag, right? Notice I'm not writing paragraph because that's not the name of the tag. The name of the tag is P. I'm writing image, or not image, but because the tag is called img. And that writes our rule, so we're going to apply to all those elements. This thing I'm writing in green with the slash and the stars, that's how you write comments in CSS. It's not the same as HTML. Instead, you're going to use the special, like, you write a slash and then a star, the comment, and then a star, and then a slash to say that you're done with the comment. Cool. So that's our selector. Those are going to apply to all elements of that particular tag of that type. We'll learn next week or later about how we can select, we can style only individual distinct elements, not all of them at once. For now, we're going to go with all of them at once, just again, we're covering the very, very basics of what we need. Okay. We write the selector, and then we're going to write a set of curly braces. So you got to find the curly brace on the keyboard. We use every key on the keyboard. So we write a curly brace, open the curly brace, close the curly brace generally on the next line. Again, white space doesn't matter in CSS, just like it doesn't matter in HTML, but we put these things on their own lines for readability to make it easier for us to see. So it all looks like that. Inside the curly brace, inside it's called the body, or the block, it's called a block. But inside those curly braces, we're then going to list out a set of properties. And that's what these are called. Oops, sorry. These are properties. Properties are saying what kind of styling do we want to apply to those elements. Do we want to modify the font? Do we want to modify the color? Do we want to modify the size? Do we want to modify the spacing? What do we want to modify? And again, it's like you're trying to give instructions to your decorator. Are we telling them to paint? Are we telling them to hang a picture? Are we telling them to position something? What are we telling them we want to do? So each property is written has two parts. There's going to be the name of the property, followed by a colon, right? Colon, followed by the value we want to give to that property, followed by a semicolon. We use the semicolon to say, I am done telling you what that property is going to be. So in this case, I'm saying that I want my H1s to have a font family, which is how we say font. You know, what typeface you want to use. We call it font family. I want its font family to be Helvetica. I could similarly give it a color. I could say I want the H1's color to be Rebecca Purple, which is sort of the nice purple in sort of web coloring structures, named after someone's daughter, Rebecca. So refresh that. My Hello CSS is now a nice purple. Again, notice that I've written down the name of the property, a colon, and then the value. In Visual Studio Code, if you put in a color, it'll give you a little box that shows you what that color is, so you know if you're getting the right color. We'll talk more about sort of how we talk about colors again in a future video when we're talking about these properties. Similarly, I could give all paragraphs. I could give them a font family of Arial, and we give them a font size of how about 18 pixels. All right, I can make all those paragraphs really big, slightly bigger, different color kind of font, easier to read. We could notice that my H2 here hasn't been styled, only my H1 has been. My list items have also not been styled, but I could do that. I could say, let's make my list items have a font family that was Comic Sans, because I'm mean like that. Nope. Comic. Do you not have Comic Sans? Pyrus, the other ugly font. Right, we can put everything inside of the different colored fonts. We can style images. We can give them different properties. So for example, I could give this thing here, just for fun. I can give it a border radius, and I can make it into a circular image, right? We can do some styling to say what we want these things to be. We can also indicate things like sizes, right? I can give this thing a max width of 200 pixels, and then I can make it smaller if I want to. So there's lots of different properties we can use to apply to our elements. We'll learn about more of these properties and how they work and what your options are as we go. You don't need to learn these things now. Again, the thing that I want you to remember, right, the main takeaways here is this styling type things. That we write down the selector, right, what elements we want to apply to, followed by some curly braces. Then we're going to write down the properties, each on their own line with a semicolon at the end, with the name of the property and then the value we want to assign to it as we go. If you forget a semicolon, you'll notice that you get the little squiggle, like typo squiggle that you see in Word as well. And what will happen is that property will basically stop working. So the font family no longer is Helvetica because there's no semicolon, so it doesn't know that you're done. And then because that's not done, the color also doesn't show up correctly. But these rules do continue to work fine. If you make mistakes in the browser, that's okay, right? We all make mistakes and we can fix them. Like nothing's breaking, there's nothing ruined about the world, right? That's fine. It's a mistake. We fix it. But with mistakes with CSS, particularly like typos like that, you're not going to get like an error. You're not going to get something that tells you made a mistake. You're just going to have to sort of look at the browser and be like, that doesn't look correct. What was I trying to do, right? Where was I trying to modify this H1? Let me find the rule that modifies it and then look to see, did I maybe make a typo somewhere? It gets a little bit tricky. It's a little bit like trying to find typos in your essays. It requires, practice sort of doing kind of close reading of your text to sort of make sure what you're doing. The same kinds of skills will apply for any other writing you've ever done. There we go. But that's the basics of CSS. Again, a lot of when people say they know CSS is we're going to learn different ways to select elements to apply styling to only particular images or only particular paragraphs. And we'll learn lots of different properties we can use to add more and more neat effects, kind of like at those where we get to these kind of effects similar to what we did for this image here. So we'll get there. We're just going to get there later. Okay, so again, there's lots of properties we can include. I talked about font family. We did font size. There's a font weight for boldness. We've talked about color. There's also a background color if you want to change the background color of something. You can specify padding to add spacing, and there's many, many, many more. There are more CSS properties than there are HTML elements. So there's like hundreds of CSS properties. We will not learn all of them. You don't need to learn all of them, but you can always look them up if you want to then find out more details about how an individual piece works. Okay. The last note I want to do about CSS is that I want to acknowledge the fact that we've learned that there's two languages that we're going to use when doing web development here. And there's two languages you're learning just in this first week of class: HTML and CSS. And so the question is, why do we have two of these languages? Why do we have to do two different things? And they look totally different. So this is the reason we have two languages is following a principle from computer programming, which is the most important principle that we follow, which is the idea of separation of concerns. The basic idea is we want to keep things that do different work separate from each other, and we're going to use different languages to do different things because they're different, right? HTML has one purpose and CSS has a different purpose, and so they're written in different ways because they're designed to do different things. It's the same way that like prose, like a book is written different than poetry. They're designed to do different things, so you pick a different language to work on. So the reason we keep these two things separate, we have these two different languages, is we're really going to try to keep our content separate from the appearance of that content. So my HTML file has all of my content, right? It has all my text, it has all my words, it has what my images are, and it has what they mean, right? Our HTML says that these things are paragraphs, these things are lists, these things are images. My CSS has information about what it looks like. That's visual appearance. It tells me what font are those paragraphs in? What color should that heading be? What size should this image be? All the appearance information is defined by the CSS. All the content is defined by the HTML. by keeping these things separated and keeping them in like distinct files even, it means that we can apply the same styling to different content, right? I can use the same style sheet, the same like theme, and apply it to lots of different web pages across my site. So I can have every single page from my library's website have the same set of styling because they're all working off of the same style sheet. They're all using the same set of rules about how things should be decorated. Similarly, it actually means that because I can keep the same content and I can potentially modify just the CSS to make it so it gets presented in different ways to different people. So I can have my same file, for example, my same HTML file be displayed one way for someone who's working on a giant laptop or a giant desktop, and someone else for someone who's working on a phone, or someone else who's trying to access it from their watch, which you can do. Or I can have it work one way, have one set of content that looks one way for someone who is, just working on their basic desktop, and work another way for someone who is visually impaired and so needs to be able to have everything, have the contrast up really high and have fonts really big and have to be able to style it some other way to make it easier for them to read. So we can be able to support things like accessibility. We can support multiple different kinds of devices. We can basically make our page more accessible to a broader number of people by being able to keep our appearance distinct from the actual content we care about. So one way this kind of works together is the idea is that our HTML is defining all of our semantics, like what things mean. Our CSS is then defining the appearance. Now, HTML does have some default styling that goes with it, right? When I made this in H1, right, it got bigger and bold even before I tried modifying the font, the typeface, and modifying the color. That's useful, right? Sure, there's some semantics that have some styling appearance, but we don't actually want to use HTML because of what it looks like. We want to use HTML because of what it means. So my favorite example of this is that there is an HTML element that we never use that's called an I element. It's old, it's not used anymore, but it still exists. And I stands for italics. So if I have some text that says this text has emphasis with the italics there, I'll show you, demonstrate that it works, right? This text is italicized. Now, if I just use an I element, that tells it to me to look italicized, right? Make all the letters slanty, but it doesn't tell us why it's italicized, right? Why am I making those letters slanty? Is it because it's important? Is it because it's the name of a book? Is it because I just think slanty letters look nice and I just like the appearance of, I want to just tilt my head over? It doesn't tell us the meaning behind that. So what we want to do instead is we want to make sure we're using semantic HTML that actually tells us what the purpose of that text is. So the reason that we want to say we want this thing to be emphasized is because it's important. So we're going to use an element, EM, that says this thing should be emphasized, right? We're going to change it so it actually tells us that where our HTML reflects the content, not the appearance. So yes, that makes it look slanty, but that's not the point. From the HTML's perspective, we're just trying to say that this word is important. What we can then, right, that says nothing about the appearance. I mean, by default, emphasized things will be slanty, but that's not required. We can, in fact, write some CSS to change that. We could write a CSS rule that applies to EM elements that makes their font style be normal, right? Don't be slanty, be normal, straight up and down. And we can give them a text decoration of underlined. So we can make it so that emphasized text isn't slanty, it's underlined. Or we can make it so emphasized text isn't slanty, it's big and red. We can make it so that emphasized text is blinking. Don't do that, but we can do that kind of thing. The idea here is that the visual appearance is distinct from the actual content. If someone is working off a screen reader, if they're blind, they don't care about the visual experience. They don't care whether it's slanted or not. They just want to say, oh, that's important. It needs to get read in a louder voice. It needs to get emphasized in some way where the screen reader can indicate this is emphasized. So the idea here is that our HTML indicates all of our semantics, not the appearance. We actually don't want to write any HTML to do appearance level work. We only want to write HTML that defines what that content needs to be. All of our appearance work is going to come out of our CSS. Right? HTML describes the meaning, not what it looks like. Okay, so that's why we have two different languages. And again, we'll go into more detail about how we can make our HTML accessible and how we can use, how this affects our CSS, and then all the different ways we can use CSS more in the future. The purpose here is to really, again, to give you a taste for what CSS is and to know why you shouldn't be trying to go find like how to use, don't think about trying to use HTML to style things. We use CSS to style it, right? HTML just says what it is. CSS is going to tell us what it looks like. And again, the way that we can do that, we write our style sheets, we define our rules. We're going to have lots of different rules. Each rule has a selector, what element applies to, and then a set of properties, what properties we want to apply. That should cover the most basics of CSS, and we'll add in more details again as we go sort of further through the class.